Well, I don't believe it. I'm actually doing 2 videos here in one night. I'm working on 2 bikes at the same time here in my garage, which I call my shop, which is nothing more than the garage in my home. This particular video is on carburetors. Now, if you're driving a bike built since 2004 or 5, the chances are your motorcycle does not have carburetors on it. If you're driving anything before 1999, 96, I guess, chances are if you don't have carburetors, you're probably running into all sorts of interesting fuel injection problems. Anyway, regardless, that's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke. Fuel injection is the way to go these days. You get fantastic response on a well-tuned bike or properly set up bike, along with great fuel mileage. On this particular this particular engine you're looking at here is a 1986, I believe, Yamaha 750, air-cooled 750, and it has carburetors on it. These carburetors this bike was very responsive when it was new. These carburetors did a great job of fantastic sporty throttle response, but like all carburetors, they can't match the fuel efficiency of modern fuel injection. Regardless, I just want to talk a little bit about some just simple things that you don't have to be an expert to know or to deal with, but that can be very helpful if you happen to have an old motorcycle like this that you've been on the road and you're running into carburetor problems. Just a few quick points. First of all, you'll see this has the Airbox on it. If you're looking at buying a used bike that does not have the Airbox, that uses individual filters, be prepared for a lot of frustration unless you really know what you're doing. Because individual filters in this area here, and you can tell when you look through the engine, through the bodywork, if it has it on it, you can look past the carburetor and see a paper filter here, as opposed to a big plastic box with these horns. If you have paper filters, you have individual air filters. These bikes were not designed or tuned, and these carburetors were not designed to run individual filters. So when you do that, you give up some serious performance in the low end of the engine. However, individual filters do allow dramatically increased airflow at high RPMs. So you will increase typically your performance at high RPMs. The problem with increasing your response at high RPMs, or only increasing it at high RPMs, or only making it effective at higher RPMs, is that it makes the motorcycle less streetable. In other words, you have to rev it up off the line every time, and almost peel through your clutch. Even around town, even when you slow down, you've got to rev it up with the clutch in just to get going. Once it gets going in high revs, you're fine. That's why I recommend, if you're buying a used bike, stay away from individual filters. Look for a bike with the original Airbox. It was a common hot rodding technique, ineffective but common, to remove this and replace it with filters. I don't recommend doing that. Inside there now, you can apply you can get some additional performance by using an aftermarket air filter such as a K&N or some D&P, I think is another one. EBC now sells air filters that apparently are very good. Anyway, that's one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing is, if you're buying an old bike like this and you get it home and bike looks fine, but it just seems to cough and sputter when you start it, even until the bike gets really warm, it's coughing and sputtering a lot, or lacks smooth acceleration. Chances are you have some deposit buildup inside the carburetor. Now, if you look here, this is the bowl of the carburetor. This is where all the gasoline is stored. And from this tiny little tank of gasoline below the carburetor, there are little tubes and pipes that draw it up into the carburetor, into the airflow that's whipping through here to be exploded in here and used for combustion. Anyway, in here, with all this gasoline sitting in there, if it sits for any extended period of time, it tends to leave a thin little layer. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you can't. And that thin layer tends to line all these little pipes and tubes and reduces the orifices inside them, and thus reduces their effectiveness. So what I would recommend doing not to take this apart necessarily, but to go out and buy a bottle of seafoam gas additive. You can buy just about any automotive supply shop for about $6, and run it through your tank. Run 2 tanks, 2 bottles of it through if you want, but 1 bottle usually does the trick. Half a bottle with the first tank, run it through, take it for a couple hour drive, put the second bottle through, let it sit overnight, okay, with that seafoam half in here and half down here, and then run it the next day, let it sit another night without going through that whole tank, and then finally on the 3rd day, finish off that second tank of fuel. And tell me you don't see a difference. That usually is strong enough stuff to take that thin layer of that varnish, as they refer to it, off all the goodies inside here. If that doesn't work, you're going to have to pop this apart with some carburetor cleaner and scrub it out. Now, the last thing I'll go through with you is just a little guide on how these things work, these carburetors work. As you can see this pin right here, when you twist your wrist, what this does is there's a butterfly valve in here. It rotates around this here and actually opens to allow air to pass through this tube into the engine. As it allows air to pass in, the mechanism inside this carburetor attempts to, and usually does a pretty good job, attempts to inject a vapor or a mist of gasoline in that flow of air. So all you're doing is controlling the air. You're not controlling the fuel. You're just controlling the airflow. The carburetor does the job of adding the fuel. Just like modern engines, which actually use injectors here. They wouldn't have this big gizmo. They would have a little injector sitting right here squirting into this tube right here. And the only body here would be just the throttle body, just to control that airflow. This particular engine, this particular carburetor has what they call CV carburetors, or vacuum-based carburetors. And you can usually tell by this nice round shiny tube cap at the top of the carburetor. What happens is when you open up this butterfly valve and allow the air to flow through, it doesn't flow directly through. What you do is you create a little vacuum in this area here, which in turn has a pipe that sucks up a bigger gateway, okay? So as you allow that suction here to actually suck up, there's actually a rubber cap underneath this here thing that draws up what is known as a CV slide up into the air, which allows air to go through and in turn mix with gasoline. Okay? And that's why these CV carbs are so much smoother on the street than what we call direct or flat slide carbs. You can buy carburetors that have your wrist directly connected to this slide. We call them flat slides, usually used in racing, but most carburetors have a 2-stage. So you twist your wrist, open up this gateway, which creates a little vacuum here, pulls up the main gate, and in goes the air, okay? These carburetors, most of them, most common Japanese carburetors, have 2 circuits. They have what they call a pilot or starter or idle circuit, depending on how they're referred to, and they have a main circuit. The pilot circuit is what's used to keep the bike idling and to allow the bike to accelerate off of idle. So very slow engine speeds, it uses the pilot circuit. Okay, and the pilot circuit has a little jet down here, which is nothing more than a screw with a hole drilled through it, allowing the varying size of that hole, so that jet or that screw allows different amounts of fuel to flow through a tiny little tube into tiny little holes, almost perforated in the bottom here, that spray vapor or gasoline spray or up into the airflow. Okay, to adjust that, there's a little screw under here, which I can't reach here obviously, but you take the carburetors off, there's a little screw there, and you can adjust that out or in. That's really the only setting, aside from changing that pilot jet, the only setting is that little screw. And typically they come from the factory done, set, and you don't have to touch them. If you find they're not, it's running a little lean or a little rich, and I won't get into that now, then that can be adjusted by turning that screw at half turns or quarter turns, okay? And usually you do all 4 in this case. The main circuit over here consists of a much larger jet that sits deep in this bowl, buried, almost, we'll say, under the level of the gasoline. and it allows, there's a tube, so there's the jet, there's a tube, a rather large tube, and then there's another jet called the needle jet at the end of that tube. The needle is the aspect that is it looks, actually, it's much like my punch here, a little thinner, as it has a pointy end, that sits on the end of that gateway, that slide that I was talking about. And it sits down inside that needle jet, down into that tube, and almost sits close to the main jet down in the gasoline. As that slide gets pulled up, that needle allows more and more gasoline to come up into that main circuit. Now, obviously, if your pilot circuit is your slow speed, your main circuit does all the work from off idle, in other words, 2,000, 3,000 RPM, all the way up to red line. All that performance is controlled by that main jet, okay? Or the main circuit, rather. Wide open throttle, there's only one thing keeping the gasoline from getting into that air, and that's the main jet at the bottom. Half throttle, it's primarily the needle, okay? So from, let's say, 5,000 RPM up, 3,000 to, say, 6,000 in this particular case, or 7,000, 8,000, that's all controlled by the needle. How long it is, in other words, how deep it goes into that tube, in the shape of it, okay? As that goes up and down. Once that throttle's wide open, the needle's pulled out of the way, though. The only limiting factor is that jet down at the bottom. So wide open throttle, if your bike's coughing and sputtering, it's usually your main jet, okay? Now, I've probably gotten a little too deep into that than what's of any interest to you, but these, my specialty has always been sort of these old carburetors, these old Japanese carburetors. And they can be very finicky. Aside from getting all those things tuned in correctly, the individual components can actually wear. Okay, so this I'm looking at it right now. This here pivot shaft for the throttle can actually wear and cause that to jiggle and leak air. You can get wear around the butterfly of the throttle. You can get wear on the slide up front here. You can get wear on the needle. Get wear on the needle where it rubs against the inside of the tube. It can cause that tube to go egg-shaped, which I've seen in some motorcycles, which causes too much gas to get in, causes a rich situation. So you always smell gas, even when the bike is warmed up. You can smell like unburnt gas, even when it's idling, and it has a hard time pulling its own weight up the hill. Usually, it's running and it's hard on fuel too. It usually is an indication that the bike is running too rich. Okay. Anyway, that's a little carb bit. I actually had these carburetors apart, and I probably should have filmed that process, but I didn't. Right now, with this particular bike, I have a few things left to do to get it back into ship shape and clean it up a little bit, and that'll be out of here. Anyway, until next time.